here. I'll be presenting work by a large group of us across two different papers. The first one is going to be on intergenerational mobility and is a bit more mature work. We've been working on this for a long time. That's joint work with Paul Novosad, who I've been working with for many years, and Charlie Rafkin, who's an excellent PhD student at MIT. And then we have this newer paper on segregation, and that's joint work with Anjali Adukia of the University of Chicago, Kurtar Jha of Development Data Lab, who I think is on this call, and Brandon Tan, another PhD student at Harvard. And that's much newer work, and really, really keen to get people's thoughts on both, but particularly that newer work. Okay, so let's just dive right in. So this is going to be a combination of two papers. It's going to be a bit of a rushed hour. Unfortunately, I won't be able to get into all the details of both papers, but I hope I can at least do the big ideas justice. In the first paper, we're going to be looking at intergenerational mobility and specifically focusing on upward mobility. And what we mean by this is the life outcomes of people born to parents in the sort of towards the bottom of the distribution. And there are many different ways of doing this. You can look at income, look at how parental income predicts child income when they grow up and get jobs. You can look at education, as we're going to be doing here. You can look at occupations and so on. So we're going to focus on education because in India and many other developing countries, that's the best intergenerationally linked data. And so we're going to look at when you're born to relatively low education parents, what determines who gets more or less education in that next generation. And specifically, we're going to come up with a measure that allows us to compare mobility across different communities, across different time periods, and across different geographies within India. And we're going to come up with this measure that's very close to what we consider sort of the cutting edge of mobility work that's being done with very detailed income data from, like, say, tax records in richer countries like the United States and Denmark, but that works well. This measure works well with coarser education data. And what we're finding in that paper is that while SCs and to a lesser extent STs have been closing some of the gap with more forward castes, Muslims are actually falling further behind. The gap is opening up even larger between Muslims and forward castes, but also between Muslims and SCs. And we try to get into the forces that may be at play here and find evidence that a number of the other leading theories don't seem to explain a whole lot of the variation, but that the cluster of affirmative action policies, reservations, and so on that are targeted to SCs and STs maybe, and not to Muslims, may be explaining some of this divergence. And then in the second paper, as I said, much newer work, we're going to be studying residential settlement patterns and access to public facilities by marginalized communities. Specifically, we're going to be focusing on SCs and on Muslims. We don't focus on STs in the segregation paper because we're really trying to get at this question of whether rural inequalities are being reproduced in India's growing cities. There aren't a whole lot of STs in India's cities. And so what we do to study this is, though we're certainly going to study ST settlement patterns more in the future, to study these questions, we create this data set of 1.2 million urban and rural neighborhoods in India. It's very challenging to study segregation. You need to know exactly where people live and who else lives around them and what everyone's community characteristics are. And then if you want to connect that to economic outcomes, you need to have economic outcomes and provision of public goods and so on. And so we put together a really first of its kind data set covering over 1 million neighborhoods across all of India. We're asking this question of whether these rural patterns are being replicated in India's cities. We largely find yes. These two communities, SCs and Muslims, have very high levels of segregation. And we find evidence of very large disparities in the placement of educational and health facilities. That neighborhoods that are predominantly SC or Muslim, particularly those neighborhoods that are predominantly Muslim, are much less likely to get public health facilities and educational facilities. And we'll get into that. Okay. So let's start on mobility. I'll present the whole mobility paper, then we'll move over to segregation. Basically, what we end up finding in intergenerational mobility is that it really hasn't changed from before liberalization to the present. So India has grown enormously over this time period, many political changes, economic changes, huge growth in educational attainment overall, but not in mobility, not in the probability that if you're born to low education parents, that you're gonna get sort of higher levels of education. But this overall flat trend over the last several decades covers up huge variation from one group to another, especially among men, but we can show you results for women as well. So basically over this time period, scheduled castes and scheduled tribes have had rising mobility, particularly scheduled castes who have closed about half of the mobility gap with forward and other groups. But Muslim mobility is not just flat, but actually declining. And it's that decline in Muslim mobility that's offsetting gains in scheduled castes and tribes that's leading to this overall flat mobility curve over the last several decades, because actually mobility for forward/other groups has been unchanged. And then we look into a number of these different channels. We look at differential birth rates, we look at where people live, and what we really find is that affirmative action appears to be a key channel for the SC Muslim divergence that we're observing. Why study intergenerational mobility in India? I may not need to spend too much time motivating this question for this audience. I hope people are on board with the fact that this is something very important to study. Certainly, historically, India's caste system was and continues to be a set of social norms that strongly sanction intergenerational mobility, that limit the ability of individuals to rise up in the educational ranking, in occupations, spatially, and so on. But as I said, the last several decades have seen absolutely huge changes in India. Rising urbanization, exit from agriculture, economic growth overall, a large decline in poverty, various anti-discrimination policies. Have these led to changes in intergenerational mobility? Certainly access to opportunity is a very heated, and rightly so, political issue in India today. And so what we're gonna do is we're really gonna look at across all of these different communities, what's happening to children born to low education parents. Are they doing better over time? And really we're gonna focus on this question of, are they doing better over time relative to their peers? Okay, what we're trying to do is separate out the fact that the tide is rising overall, that people are getting more and more education overall in India. Growth is happening, that's a good thing, and we're certainly not denying that. We're asking the question of when you're born to relatively poor parents, and that relative poverty is a moving target over time, but when you're born in what our measure is going to be is in the bottom half of the parental education distribution, how are your life outcomes changing over time? And we're going to do this across scheduled castes, across scheduled tribes and Muslims. Is there a question?
Yeah, just a quick one. Do you also look at how residential segregation affects Muslim education outcomes, and if that has an impact at all?
Yeah, so let me bracket segregation entirely until the second half of the presentation when we look at that paper. It's a really, really good question. I'm going to show you much more on kind of how much segregation there is and how that affects the public provision of health and educational facilities. Because we know that all neighborhoods, all communities are supposed to be getting equal access to health facilities, to education, and so on. And so it's a particularly nice thing to focus on there. We don't yet have really good, we haven't really focused on educational attainment, but it's something that we really, really want to get into. It's a very tricky thing to study causally. Like, we're not going to say a whole lot about the causal effects of segregation in that segregation paper, because we know that people are sorting themselves into segregated neighborhoods. And if different types of people are sorting themselves into neighborhoods of different levels of segregation, then we can't attribute differences that we see across these neighborhoods to the segregation itself. Maybe it's something about the people who are kind of showing up in these neighborhoods in the first place. So at the end of the talk, I'll talk about how, like, we actually don't have very good causal evidence on a lot of these things. Like, really the talk today is going to be about establishing sort of core facts that I think deserve a whole lot more attention, and hopefully set up research agendas. Obviously, a bunch of people are already working in this space, but we hope that our work can kind of help more people come into this space and focus on these issues. Because certainly by the end of today's talk, I'm not expecting anyone to walk away saying, oh, wow, these guys have really nailed, the causes and consequences of mobility and segregation. We hope we're putting some important facts out there that can facilitate more research. Any other questions right now?
Yeah, I have a quick question. I wanted to know that do you study Muslim as a one homogeneous community, or you have further studied the categorization within it? And when you compare Muslims, so how do you do that? Like, do you compare Muslim as a category with Hindu as an entire category, or like do you only compare them with the forward caste among Hindus?
Great. So great questions. So yeah, we're going to treat Muslims as a single community. We obviously are not pretending that all Muslims are the same. People from all of these different communities are coming from very, very different backgrounds, live in different geographies, speak different languages, and so on. What we're trying to do here is establish these big facts about what's happening to Muslims compared to SCs, STs, and others. But there's always more granularity that one could and should go into at some point. We kind of have to draw the limits for each paper and say, look, we already are, we're already dealing with kind of too much probably in each of these papers. We also have a challenge in that we're not very good in our data, at least, at knowing more about the different sort of Muslim communities that people are coming from within the broader group. And I'll talk about how we're even classifying people. One of the things that we do as a research team and at Development Data Lab, this organization that I co-founded, is we're really, really keen on putting our data out there into the public so that we can facilitate further work by others. We know that we can never do justice to the issues we're working on in any given paper or even in a set of papers. And we know that we don't have, all of the good ideas. We're not living these experiences. We're not as knowledgeable as we would like to be, or as the world is, about these issues. And so our hope is that by doing this research and then putting our data out there in as granular a fashion as is possible, that many more people can kind of pick this up and run with it and can test further ideas. I'm going to be talking about, for the segregation work, the way we classify names using machine learning algorithms as either Muslim or non-Muslim. Now, that categorization isn't perfect. We show that it's really, really good. Potentially, you could use the names to do even finer classifications and tell which different Muslim communities people might be coming from, right? And so someone who has more expertise than I do in this could kind of take that data, run with it, and potentially do really, really interesting work showing kind of differences within Muslim communities. But we're just going to stop at comparing Muslims to others. Okay. So what's the challenge? Yes.
Yeah, I just have a quick question about the first statement on the previous slide. Can you just go to the previous slide?
Yep. Sorry.
How does historical caste system sanction intergenerational mobility? Isn't it a set of social norms that restrict intergenerational mobility?
Yeah, sorry. So sanction we're using here to mean limit. Sanctions, that's a bad word choice here. Sanction can mean both approve and sort of discriminate against. So we're talking about the fact that the caste system has limited mobility by saying that that you can't get higher levels of education, or you can't take different occupations or live in different spaces. All of these social norms, basically I understand as limitations on the ability of people to freely move into different parts of the socioeconomic and spatial distribution. Great. Okay. So what's the challenge of estimating intergenerational mobility? I'm not going to get very much into the weeds of the methods that we developed for this paper. It just takes a really long time. I run out of time even on 1.5 hour long seminars just dedicated to this paper. But I just want to kind of sketch the basic idea here. And the basic idea here is that when you're working with really detailed income data, like researchers in the United States get access to from the IRS, the tax authority in the United States, they're able to match up the exact earnings of the parents with the exact earnings of the kids. And so that they can know exactly, they ask the question of, if you're born to parents at the 25th percentile of income in their generation, what is your expected percentile of income in your generation, right? And you can do that because income is a continuous distribution and they have access to the full distribution of income data. And they've matched up all the parents and kids in the IRS tax data. When it comes to India, there's no, only 2% of people pay income tax. Even if I got access to the income tax data, which no one would grant me, I wouldn't trust it. And so it's really just not useful for studying these things. So what we need is something else, some other measure of socioeconomic status that is linked across generations in a reliable way. And you can't use earnings data because you only observe parents and children together in most studies when they actually live in the same house. And we know that when people get high levels of education, they often leave the house. We know that women almost always leave the house for marriage, and so on and so forth. So what you need is something that you can reliably link without these sort of selection biases. And that for us is education. People have been using educational mobility for a long time. It's a really good measure of your socioeconomic status overall. It doesn't map perfectly into income or the respect you get in society or anything else, but it's a pretty good measure of sort of your place in society. It's fixed early in life and it's easily remembered. So someone can ask me, and I actually, like if you ask me what level of education did your parents get, I can tell you like, oh, my mom got a master's degree. And I can even tell you, I actually know that like none of my grandparents graduated from college. I can tell you that because like that's just known within my family. People know the education levels of their parents, right? And so it's a really good measure of socioeconomic status, and it's something that's easily asked of people about their parents, regardless of whether their parents are alive or dead, whether they live in the same house as their parents or not. But the big challenge with education is that it comes in these really coarse bins. And so when we look at education data in most surveys, they'll usually have a question that says like, tell us the category of education that your parents got. 0 to 2 years of education, 2 to 5, 5 to 9, 9 to 12. Usually it maps to the levels of kind of different types of schooling in different countries. So in India, it's going to be primary and middle and secondary and senior secondary, and then post-secondary. But the point is that these are really big bins. And so, for example, in the 1960s, what you can see in this figure here, in the 1960s birth cohort of men, if you look at their father's level of education, what we see is that 57% of men born in the 1960s were born to fathers in the lowest educational category, which is 0 to 2 years of education. Okay, so it's not that all of their fathers had the same level of human capital or the same level of education exactly. Some of them had 0, some of them had 1, some of them had 2, right? Some of them dropped out halfway through the second year, but they're all in the same bin in our data. And so it's very difficult for us to do what they're doing in the United States or in Denmark and say, okay, what's happening to people born to 25th percentile fathers? Because we don't know who's at the 25th percentile. We just know who's in that big bin between 0 and 57. And so we're going to need to come up with a better measure of intergenerational mobility that doesn't require that specificity of knowing exactly where your dad or mom lies in, say, the income distribution. Oh, this keeps, there we go. And so this shows that there are, given the uncertainty in the data, there are many different conditional expectation functions. And a conditional expectation function just maps from parental outcomes, in this case, education, to expected child outcomes, in this case, child education. And both of this we're looking at in ranks. The point is that there are many different conditional expectation function curves that fit the moments in our data, that fit the data as we see them, which is in these bins. So, whoops, that didn't come out quite right. But the goal here is that what we're trying to do is come up with a generalized method that allows you to ask basically any question of this conditional expectation function. So there's a bunch of uncertainty about what the conditional expectation function is exactly, but we do see a bunch of points. So we do have some sort of constraints on it. And what we come up with is we say, look, we can actually bound the conditional expectation function over any arbitrary range from A to B. So from parental ranks, what's happening, what's the expected outcome of kids born to parents from parental education ranks 37 to 64? We can ask that question, but with this method, but what we're going to do is focus on what we call bottom half mobility, which says you're born to parents in the bottom half of their educational distribution. Okay, so men born in the 1960s, their parental education distribution looked like this. And so we're going to ask, okay, what's happening to men born to parents in the bottom half? And now we don't observe the bottom half exactly because we observe the bottom 57%, but we can bound that number pretty tightly and say, here's the expected rank of men in their educational cohort born to parents in the bottom half. And this is very close in spirit to this measure that I've mentioned a couple times already, which Chetty et al. In studying outcomes in the United States and others looking elsewhere call absolute upward mobility, which is the expected rank of a child born to parents at the 25th percentile, which is in the middle of the bottom half. We're expanding that range out to the whole bottom half, and then we can estimate that number. And what's nice there is that once we have this method for estimating that number, we can go and say, okay, how's that changing over time in India overall? How's that changing? How does that vary across different communities, from Muslims, SCs to STs to others? And how does that vary from men to women or urban to rural areas and so on? And so once we have the statistic that is meaningful and the same across all these different groups, we can now compare across groups and understand how things are changing and what are the correlates of high or low mobility. So one of the things that you can see here is that when we do a bounding exercise, basically there are these other measures of mobility that are very, very imprecise. And so, for example, the 1960s birth cohort, looking at the rank gradient, which is just the correlation between, say, fathers and sons' educational ranks, we can't differentiate India from the US or Denmark because the bounds are so large. Likewise, on this measure of absolute upward mobility, looking at children born to parents at the 25th percentile, because again, we don't know exactly who's at the 25th percentile, so we have a ton of uncertainty about what the outcomes are of children born to parents at the 25th percentile. But then when you look at this bottom half mobility on the right, we get much tighter estimates. And we can see, we can differentiate both between India and Denmark and the US in any given point in time, but also we can see what's happening over time. What is going on here? Okay, looks like the titles will come back properly in a slide. So for this mobility work, we're going to use two primary data sources. We're going to use the IHDS, which may be familiar to a number of you. This is a great data set. If you haven't worked with it before, it's freely available. It's really, really rich. They've conducted 2 rounds and they're in the process of conducting a 3rd one right now. It's really India's only open access panel data set, because the NSS and others don't actually track households and individuals over time. But what's really critical for us about this survey is that they ask questions about parental education. And as I said before, that's what we're going to need in order to link education over time and be able to say what's happening to intergenerational mobility. And then they also record caste, and they also record religion and SC and ST status. So we're going to be able to compare these different communities. And we have basically all these results, even though we're going to be looking back in time, all these results are coming from the 2012 data, because we're going to be able to say that, like, I was born in the 1980s birth cohort, and someone else was born in the 1970s birth cohort, and someone else was born in the 1960s birth cohort. So we're going to be able to look back in time from a single cross section, because we know when you were born, and regardless of when you were born, they ask the question of how much education did your parents get? So that's going to be the basis of much of the work that we do in this mobility paper, but we also use the socioeconomic and caste census from 2012, for which we have the microdata. We only know parent and child education linked when they're in the same household, but what we know at a really, really high resolution is where people live. And so this is really useful, not for going back in time. We can only look at, actually, we end up restricting ourselves to 20 to 23-year-old men, because they're very likely to have both finished their education and to still live with their fathers. And so we're not, the fact that we only see them when they're co-resident with their fathers isn't such a problem. But we know exactly what village people live in, we know what town people live in, and we know the characteristics of those places. And so we can look at what are the correlates of intergenerational, high and low intergenerational mobility.
Sam, I said, yeah, sorry, Cindy, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted a small clarification. You were saying that parents' education is reported in IDS, then why are we only looking at father-son mobility, and why is there no mention of mother's education?
No, so we So a couple of things. We are going to be talking about mother's education as well. The primary measure is going to be with fathers to sons. I should have clarified this earlier. So we have mother's education as well. In general, and particularly going back in time, women have had such low levels of education that we have extraordinarily imprecise measures of mobility as a function of mother's education rather than father's education. So I'll show you some comparisons of mothers and fathers and of sons and daughters. But because there's basically much more distribution, much more variance in father's education and in son's education, that'll be our primary measure here, but we do it all different ways. So we can kind of learn the most about mobility from looking at fathers and sons, but obviously mothers and daughters are super important as well. And we try to kind of do as much justice as we can to the data that we have. One of the nice things about our measure, and I was describing this as like, we're going to look at bottom half mobility as our primary measure, but you can actually look at like, what's the expected rank of children born to parents in the bottom 80%. Like the bottom 80% actually gives you much tighter bounds when it comes to using mother's education, because there's so many mothers in the bottom educational bins, particularly when you go back in time, that if you restrict to the bottom half, you have tons of uncertainty. If you restrict to the bottom 75 or 80%, you actually can kind of classify mothers much more easily and get much tighter estimates for what's happening to their children.
Thanks.
Arishie, I think you had a question as well.
Yeah, I was wondering if you use Jati data at all from these data sets. If you have access to those.
So we don't. We literally are just so in the SECC they collected very detailed Jati data. They didn't release it, and so in fact they only semi-released any of this stuff. We like scraped these data over a very long time when they were posting them. And so, but they never put out the religion information. They never put out the Jati information, which is some of the richest information in there. And so we're mostly using the IHDS here. The IHDS does have Jati, but like once you start cutting it up into smaller and smaller Jatis, one, this paper already has a lot in it already, and two, once you start cutting it up into smaller and smaller Jatis, remember we're restricting ourselves to children born to low education parents. We're interested in comparing across cohorts, right? And across gender and across space and all of these things. And so you start getting into very, very small groupings that we don't trust that we can get really accurate estimates for them. But again, we put all of our code out there and the IHDS is openly available. And so people who are interested in comparing, within Dalits or within other groups totally can.
Thank you.
So what you can see here is this is our overall result, looking at all of India, looking at what is the expected educational rank of children born to parents in the bottom half of their cohorts distribution. And what you can see is that for all India, mobility has been flat. If I'm born in the bottom half, I expect to achieve about the 37th percentile of education, right? Which means that if I'm born in the top half, I expect to achieve about the 63rd percentile of education. So obviously we all know it's better to be born to highly educated parents than to less highly educated parents. But there's some mean reversion. If there were perfect immobility, then the expected rank of children born to the bottom half parents would be 25. But actually it's considerably higher than that. This is low by international standards, but not perfect immobility. I think that's a bit of a straw man to knock down here, but we are learning something already. But the big finding here is that it's been flat. Here you can see fathers and daughters, and here you can see is that we have like you can basically see that we don't really know whether it's been flat or not. I mean, it's within a relatively narrow range between 35 and 40, even going back to the 60s birth cohort, but there's quite a bit of uncertainty there. But let's look at this by subgroup, because this flat line, as I said already, is really covering up a lot of variation. Again, we're back to fathers and sons here. So what you can see is we group together forward castes and OBCs for matters of classification and other things. Like we don't think we're doing a great job of differentiating between them. And again, this is another thing that people could really take forward and break apart these groups in further research. But basically that's been pretty flat. Their outcomes it's always been better, shockingly, to be forward or other than it has been to be scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, or Muslim. Even though these are all, we're only looking at the educational ranks of children born to parents in the bottom half. Children born to parents in the bottom half, if they're belong to forward or other castes, get much more education than children born to other groups whose parents are in the bottom half of their distributions. But what you can see here is there's a lot of uncertainty for the 1950s birth cohorts, but you can kind of see that that scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, and Muslims aren't clearly so far apart. What you can see is that by the 80s and 90s cohorts, basically scheduled castes have closed a bunch of the gap with forward and other castes. Scheduled tribes have made up some ground, but Muslims are actually falling further behind. So mobility for Muslims has actually been declining since like the 60s or 70s birth cohorts. And this is something that we spend the rest of the paper trying to get under the hood of.
Sam, sort of looking at the graph before, I'm also wondering, like, is education really the right measure for measuring mobility in India? Because so it could be sort of mechanical that education mobility has increased in scheduled castes and scheduled tribes because of various government measures and affirmative action. But it might be the case that they're still in the same occupation groups and therefore in lower income groups, despite the fact that they received higher levels of education than their parents.
Totally.
So
yeah. No, that's completely right. I mean, what I would say is, look, there's no right measure for mobility, right? You can look at income, you can look at overall welfare and happiness. You could look at education, you could look at social status. You know, hypothetically, you could look inside people's brains and try to see serotonin or other measures of how well off they are, right? Like there's sort of all these different things. There's no one obvious thing that like captures how well off people are in a holistic sense.
Right.
You can have high educational status and still be discriminated against, right? You can have a great job and still be discriminated against in housing. And so we're really, you know, we're not trying to pretend that this is like the final word on mobility or status or anything like that. So I completely agree with you here. And I think that more work needs to be done. One of the punchlines at the end of this presentation is going to be, we need much better data to study inequality in a more holistic way. I think we're making the most we can of the data that we have, but there's obviously so much slippage between these different things. And there are very privileged people who get very little education, but have great life outcomes. And so there's a bit of,
I guess like the question of occupational selection is especially pertinent for caste, and it might not be the case for other cultural contexts even in developing countries, just because like you're by caste tied to a particular occupation. And so for mobility, I suppose like that might be something especially important to check in the case of India, but also I imagine much more harder to do at the same time.
Yeah, I will say, you know, later on in this presentation, I'm not remembering whether I kept this particular slide, we look at returns to education. So basically the mapping from education to income for different groups. And they're not so dramatically different. And they certainly don't seem to be changing so much over time. There are some differences, but like it doesn't, so I don't think we're getting it. If somehow we had perfect linked income data, I think we'd be basically finding the same things. You know, the literature on like discrimination in labor markets is pretty weak, and we need a lot. That's one of the areas that I think we need a lot more evidence on. I think no one would be terribly surprised to find better evidence of considerable discrimination in labor markets. Certainly we have that with like, you know, the resume experiments and things like that with like Dalit names and stuff. But I think basically putting the different pieces of the evidence together, I think we're finding roughly what you would find if you looked at income. That would be my best guess, but I would love it if someone could actually pull that off. But again, that's going to require really comprehensive parent and child earnings data in a way that just doesn't exist, and that suffers from all kinds of life cycle problems and all that. Good. So I'm gonna pick up the pace a little bit here, guys, because I see that we're already more than half an hour in, 40 minutes in, and I'm not even through part of the first paper. So let me just pick it up a little bit. We've built in like half an hour to talk about these things at the end. So let me try to stick to the schedule a little bit, and maybe just interrupt for like real clarifying questions that are really critical at that very moment, and save questions for the end. And we'll make sure to have a lot of time, because I really want to do a lot of listening here and kind of hear people's perspectives on the totality of these results. So it might be most productive to talk about this stuff at the end. But was there a clarifying question here?
No, I think we're good to go.
Okay, great. So
Yeah,
when
sorry,
we look at,
I just wanted. I'm so sorry.
go ahead.
We just wanted to ask, are you also going to talk about what explains the variation starting 1960 between Muslim and SCs, or that's not something we are going to talk about?
Yeah, let me tell you what we are finding on sort of reasons for these things. I think it's, you know, highly imperfect, but I want to get to that part of the talk too. So so here I go. So when we look at downward mobility, so this is looking at children born to parents in the top half of the education distribution. What we see is the same broad pattern of forward and other castes having much better outcomes than everyone else, but we don't see this divergence between SCs, STs, and Muslims. So we actually see that they're all pretty close. So whatever is going on that's causing this divergence between Muslims and SCs, it's really happening to children of low education Muslims, not to children of higher education Muslims. This is not a sort of across the board pattern. Pretty similar patterns for daughters, except that again, this is upward mobility again. Daughters don't seem to be falling, Muslim daughters don't seem to be falling behind SCs. So really this is like sort of narrowing the results here and saying like, whatever this is about the sons of low education Muslim parents. We find huge variation in mobility across space. This is one of my favorite maps. In some sense, it looks like, I mean, it's a tragic map as well, but like these are not good things, but I think we learn a lot from this. So you can see a number of things here. One is that, you know, this looks like a bunch of other maps and that the North looks worse than the South. But you see a lot of variation, even within states like UP. You actually see the Eastern UP, which has very negative outcomes in a lot of different development measures, actually has relatively high mobility. All of those little green dots within seas of red are towns. So those are urban spaces within rural subdistricts. And you can see that in general, towns have considerably higher mobility than their surrounding rural areas. You can also see pretty significant border effects. So if you look at, say, the border between Madhya Pradesh and Maharashtra in the center of the country, or if you look at the border between like Telangana and Chhattisgarh, what you actually see is like really, really stark state border effects. So some of what's driving these mobility differences seems to be state level policies or differences. And you see these border effects even within, say, the Hindi belt. So this isn't just about like sort of different language groups having different levels of mobility. You also see that Gujarat, which in many other measures of like economic performance, say looks a lot like Maharashtra, actually in terms of mobility is very red. Looks a lot like the rest of North India, which suggests that maybe like mobility has a really important, more cultural component to it. So tons of variation to be explored here. We make these data available, so you can play around with the village and town level data and look for your own correlates of mobility and test your own theories of what might be going on here. And if for whatever reason, the data that we've put out there is not letting you do what you want to do, don't hesitate to reach out to us and we can see whether we can add to it. Even when you zoom in within specific cities, so this is looking within Delhi specifically, you see huge variation in mobility across neighborhoods. And so again, I should remind people, this is all looking at children of low education parents, okay? So this is not about comparing the children of the rich to the children of the poor. And like, obviously the children of the rich are gonna be in like posh South Delhi neighborhoods, and like the children of the poor are gonna be in other places. That's not what this is about. This is all about the children of the poor. This is all about the children of low education parents. How much education are they getting? And it's varying enormously from one Delhi neighborhood to another across very, very short radii. So you see that like across the river, in East Delhi, people have worse outcomes. You see in Old Delhi, people have worse mobility outcomes, but it's really kind of sprinkled all over. There are also sizable urban-rural gaps. And interesting, one of the big things we find is that the urban-rural gap is much bigger for daughters than it is for sons. So actually, urban daughters have higher mobility than urban sons. So the children of low education parents, the daughters are doing relatively well. These ranks are all calculated within gender. So this isn't saying that girls of low education parents are getting more education than the boys. That's not the case. Across India, boys tend to get more education than girls. But what you can see here is that the mobility gap for urban areas is sizable for sons, but it's absolutely huge for daughters. Rural daughters of low education parents are getting very, very little education, and that changes enormously when their parents are in cities. Okay, so what are the mechanisms? What we basically end up finding, and again, sorry for the formatting stuff, I must have messed something up here, is that you can't really explain this large modern Muslim SC mobility gap by differences in geography. In fact, Muslims are disproportionately urban, and urban areas, as I said, have relatively high mobility. So it actually deepens the puzzle as to why Muslims have such low mobility. We don't find very different returns to education between these groups that might be explaining part of it, that like parents aren't investing a lot in their kids' education when like there aren't very high returns, for example, due to labor market discrimination. We don't find that differences in the occupational structure or in entrepreneurship, the fact that Muslims are disproportionately have small businesses doesn't seem to be driving this result. And the fact that Muslims have slightly higher larger families, slightly more kids than scheduled castes and scheduled tribes does explain a little bit lower mobility, but really not very much of the gap that's opened up. But what we do find is that affirmative action seems to be able to explain quite a bit of the gap, or rather, when we estimate the causal effects of affirmative action on mobility, we find that the estimated effect size is about the same size as the gap that's opened up between Muslims and SCs. And so what we do here is we follow this really nice paper by Guillaume Cassan in the 2019 Journal of Development Economics. And basically there's this natural experiment where in 1977, there was a rationalization of the scheduled caste list across states. So before 1977, there were all of these jatis where if you were in UP, you were considered SC, but if you were across the border in MP, you were not considered SC. Right? And what they did in 77 is they rationalized all of this. And so there were these groups that didn't have SC status that got SC status. And what we can do is we can compare what happened to the kids who were still in school at the time that this happened, and so could get higher education as a result, could be plausibly treated educational at least by affirmative action benefits for SCs, where cohorts that were slightly older and had already finished their schooling by the time of granting SC status to these parts of jatis that were in states where they previously hadn't had SC status, those older groups couldn't benefit from it. And so what we basically see here is, and these years on the bottom are the birth cohort. So in the 1965 birth cohort, basically, many of them had finished their schooling already, had already dropped out and started working. And so they couldn't be affected by this change in status, but the subsequent groups could. And so what we see is this large mobility gap opens up between jatis, portions of jatis that were in different states and therefore had different SC status. In the early SC groups, the groups that had scheduled caste status all along had much higher mobility than late SC groups who got it only after this reform. And what we basically then see is this convergence where the late SC groups start having closer and closer mobility to their early SC peers. And we can use this trend to estimate the treatment effect of gaining SC status. Now, this is of course estimated off of only these jatis that had this split across these different states, right? It's estimating across this one reform. So it's very much what we call a local average treatment effect. It's very much just the effect for these particular groups. But we basically find is that the effect for these groups is about 10 rank points, which is about the same as the, in mobility terms, the same as the gap that's opened up between Muslims and SCs. And that's why we make the claim that like affirmative action seems to be able to explain a lot of the gap. Now, I should say, some people might find this obvious. I don't know, there's probably differences of opinions within the audience here. I was surprised by this. Remember, we're looking at mobility, so we're looking at the children of low education parents. So this is actually really standing in contrast to the sort of creamy layer critique that says that like affirmative action, the benefits are all captured by the relatively well-off within targeted marginalized communities. Because these are precisely the not well-off. These are precisely the children of parents in the bottom half of the distribution. This is not the creamy layer, and they're seeing large effects of gaining SC status and gaining access to the affirmative action programs that entails. So we thought this was really powerful in and of itself. Maybe this should have been its own paper. Maybe someone can kind of take this and dig deeper into these results. Okay, so that's this paper. I'm way behind schedule. We have supposedly 9 minutes to talk about segregation. But basically, we come up with this measure, bottom half mobility, which is valid for comparison across subgroups, across countries or geographies, across time and so on. What we find is that in this period of enormous economic transformation, enormous economic growth, political change, and so on in India, we really don't see big differences overall in mobility, but we do see these big changes across different communities. And this low educational status is increasingly persistent among Muslims, which is very, very worrying. And we think that the evidence really points towards affirmative action. But I didn't get into much of the other mechanisms, fertility and so on. So do check out the paper if you're interested in those. All right, let me get to segregation. And I really do want to kind of roughly stick to the schedule because I want to have a bunch of conversation and hear from you all. So basically, what are we finding in this paper? As I said, we put together this data set of 1 million neighborhoods and then looked at segregation and looked at economic outcomes for marginalized communities. We're finding high levels of segregation, both for Muslims and scheduled castes. We actually find considerably higher segregation for scheduled castes than we do for Muslims in both rural and urban India. We do find that these rural segregation patterns that we've sort of known about for other are being replicated in India's cities. This might not come as a huge shock to anyone in this audience, but India's cities are growing in many ways. People are doing research showing that they offer greater opportunity. Our mobility work suggests that they're offering greater opportunity in that particular measure. But in terms of segregation, they look a hell of a lot like rural India. And they don't just look like rural India, they look like nearby rural areas. Nearby rural segregation is very highly predictive of the segregation in the nearby cities. Now, what we find here is that neighborhoods that have high proportions of these marginalized communities experience far worse access to public facilities. And this is particularly true for Muslim neighborhoods, that governments across India are much less likely to put health facilities and are much less likely to put educational facilities in neighborhoods, particularly with a lot of marginalized communities, particularly that are very heavily Muslim. And this really is much higher than the standard aggregate data sources suggest. And one of the sort of broader takeaways, I think, from a lot of the research that I've been doing over the last decade or so is that we really need to look at a high spatial resolution, because it doesn't matter to me whether there are a lot of schools in my district. What matters to me is whether there are schools within reach of my village, right? It doesn't matter to me whether there are really nice schools across town in the rich neighborhoods in my city. What matters is there a primary school? Is there a secondary school close to my neighborhood that I can actually get to? And so, but that's not just true of things like access to government facilities. That's also true of labor markets. It doesn't do me a whole lot of good if there are high paying jobs very far away from me, even if they're technically within the same district. Before I started my PhD, I was living in southern Rajasthan in Udaipur district, and it can take like 8 hours to get across the district. It really doesn't matter what's happening on the other side of the district for people who are living in particular areas. In many ways, these segregation patterns look somewhat like the United States. SC segregation in India looks about as high as Black segregation in the US. But unlike in the US, we actually find that all groups are poorer in more segregated cities. So in the US, there's this big fact that Blacks are poorer the more segregated a city is, but whites aren't any poorer. They don't seem to be harmed by the segregation, the higher segregation that exists in some cities. But in India, actually all groups, both like upper castes, scheduled castes, Muslims and so on, seem to be worse off in these more segregated cities. We're also finding some differences over time, that the younger a city is, segregation is somewhat less severe, but it's going to take about 1,000 years based on the trends that we're observing for newer cities to become truly unsegregated. Okay, so obviously there's a lot of work on this already. Most of it is qualitative, particularly on Muslim ghettos and economic disadvantage. The Sutter Committee report did amass a bunch of data, but didn't release that data for a whole lot of additional analysis. And certain facts that we know from it, like the fact that villages that are more Muslim have fewer public goods. The way the data were reported, it could have just been that there are like more Muslims in UP, and UP villages have fewer public goods. And so it's really, really necessary to kind of really dig into the data. And that's part of what we're trying to do here, is create a data set that people can use to do this. We do find that Muslims and lower castes live in regions with lower levels of public goods, that this has been equalizing somewhat over time from this work by Banerjee and Somanathan. But again, there's so much that we don't know from these older analyses. I'm just going to kind of skip over this and just get right to the results. But basically what I was saying is, to do research on segregation, you really need very rich data. And it's not just rich data, but high resolution data that has often been lacking in India. So you need to know exactly what neighborhoods people live in. You need to know what communities they belong to. You need to know economic outcomes if you want to link this segregation to any sort of economic outcomes. And in our case, we really wanted to study the allocation of public facilities. And so you really need to know something about where the government is placing facilities like health and education centers. And the way we get this, the way we check all these boxes, is by combining data from the socioeconomic and caste census that has a variable for SC, doesn't have a variable for Muslim, but we're going to classify people's names, which were in the PDFs that we scraped from the socioeconomic and caste census website when they were actually putting up the PDFs. We're going to impute consumption using a technique called small area estimation. And basically what that's doing is that's combining what we know about the assets of these different households into our best guess of consumption, using coefficients from a regression from a different data set that actually has consumption and all those assets. We're going to use the economic census taken just a year after the socioeconomic and caste census in 2013, which covers every economic establishment in India. And critically, it covers both public and private facilities. And we know what types of facilities, we know what kinds of establishments these are. And so we're just going to focus on the government provision and placement of health and educational facilities. And we know that at the same enumeration block level that we know where everyone's living in the socioeconomic and caste census. Thankfully, for once, 2 Indian data sets used the same codes. And so we're actually able to match them up at the neighborhood level. Then at the town and village level, we have all this data from the population census, and then we're going to use a couple of data sets from the US to make this comparison to US Blacks. Any presentation I give, I have to give a plug for the Shrug. The Shrug is the socioeconomic high resolution rural urban geographic data platform for India. This is a high resolution aggregation of lots and lots of data from all of these different data sources, administrative data, satellite data, and so on. Covering more than 500,000 villages, 8,000 towns, 4,000 assembly constituencies from 1990 to the present. And critically, these are all using the same geographic units, which are stable over time. And so you can study outcomes at the village level, at the town level, across a very wide range of different outcomes and over time for these stable units. It's open access. It's at devdatalab.org/shrug. We're really gratified. It's now been downloaded over 10,000 times. People seem to be using it. It's really nice to see. Our hope is not just that this makes people's lives a lot easier, but that this grants access to really rich data to a lot of people who otherwise wouldn't have it. That, you know, Paul and I were very fortunate to do our PhDs at Harvard, and we had time and we had resources to put these data together. I spent way too much of my PhD putting a bunch of these data sets together. Not everyone has so much access to resources, so much access to research assistants and so on. And so we really hope that this will allow people to kind of, you know, students, professors, interested citizens, government officials, you name it, to kind of take these data down and start working with them and asking all sorts of questions that we haven't. Again, if you have issues with it, please let us know. We're constantly trying to improve it. If you have data that you might be able to contribute to it, we're taking submissions. You will get credit for it. Just tell us how you want to get cited, and people will cite your papers or however you would like to be attributed. We are really trying to grow this thing and turn it into the most useful resource possible. I should just comment that, you know, we don't have like the full census and economic census and everything up there. We don't own these data, and so we post as much of it as we can. But we try to provide the codes and the keys and all that to make it as easy as possible to link up all the different data sets that you might want to use. Okay. So as I said, SC, we know from the socioeconomic caste census, we don't know which households are Muslim, but we use the names to do this. And we use machine learning to do this because there's so many different names that we can't just kind of go through one by one and say which ones are Muslims and which ones are not. So we use training data from the National Railway exam takers, where we know their names and we know which communities they belong to, specifically whether they're Muslim or not. And then we use that training data to classify all of the names in the socioeconomic and caste census. And we do a bunch of validation that suggests that we're doing a really, really good job, like over 95% accuracy on classifying names. Obviously, there are going to be some names that we're getting wrong, but with 95% accuracy, we can be really confident in our results. And the high levels of, for example, inequalities where highly Muslim neighborhoods are getting fewer public goods, those estimates are, if anything, a slight underestimate if there's some noise in our Muslim classification. Our primary measure of segregation is called an index of dissimilarity. There are lots of different ways to measure segregation. They're basically all these inequality measures that you could use for measuring, say, inequality of income. But here it's like inequality of the distribution of communities across space. They're very highly correlated, and so we just run with this index of dissimilarity. Though in the final paper, we'll show robustness to different measures. I've already talked about how to measure consumption. Let me just get to, so the main regression we're going to run in this paper is really, we're going to show some descriptive stats on segregation, but the main regression we'll run is really just regressing outcomes. And those can be like the placement of a public facility, that can be consumption for a particular community, on the share of that neighborhood that is SC, the share of the neighborhood that is Muslim, and then we'll use like a fixed effect for the city. So we're really just comparing neighborhoods within cities. We're just trying to say, are neighborhoods that have more marginalized groups within cities, because some cities are poorer or richer than others, but within cities, are neighborhoods that have a higher proportion of marginalized communities, are they poorer, do they get fewer public facilities and so on. And we're gonna do this separately for rural and urban areas to ask this question of whether rural patterns are getting reproduced in urban areas. So basically, we first look at rural areas. We find that they're really segregated, though the segregation measure varies by scale. Segregation is a very, very local phenomenon. We get the highest levels of segregation when we're looking very, very locally, which makes some amount of sense, right? Like households are almost perfectly segregated due to very, very low intermarriage rates in India. Like households are almost entirely Muslim or non-Muslim. Usually, like, you know, if you look at a few houses, they're very highly correlated. The fact that one house is Muslim makes the house next door very likely to be Muslim. But then as you zoom out and out, there's less and less of that segregation. But what we find is these big disparities in public goods access, where places that have a lot of marginalized groups have fewer schools, have fewer health centers. We're not even getting into the quality of these places. We can't measure the quality of these places, but we can at least see if they're there or not. And we can see that they're less likely to be there in general. And we find that living standards are lowest, particularly for these marginalized groups, when they're surrounded by a lot of other members of their own communities. But actually in rural areas, at least, people who are not SC or Muslims are actually richest when they're around a lot of Muslims and SCs. And that's something that's going to differ in urban areas. So I'm really not going to be able to do justice to this paper, but let me just kind of zoom through and show you. First of all, I'll focus on the extent of segregation when I get to the urban areas, because we can at least compare with US Blacks there. But these are high levels of segregation, and we consistently find that scheduled castes are more segregated even than Muslims. We find when we run that regression that I just told you about, we find that areas with marginalized groups are considerably less likely to have public goods, but this is particularly true for Muslims. So basically, scheduled caste areas are a bit less likely to have primary schools than the average, a bit less likely to have secondary schools than the average. No real differences when it comes to health centers, but we see these big disparities for Muslim areas, where Muslim neighborhoods are just much less likely to have primary schools, much less likely to have secondary schools than the rest of areas. And this actually, here we're using sub-district fixed effects. So we're just comparing neighborhoods within sub-districts. You can go all the way down to the panchayat level and these results hold. So just within panchayats, the area that's likely to get the secondary school, if that panchayat has a secondary school, is the non-Muslim area.
Just a quick clarification, these are all public goods, so the schools are, the primary and the secondary schools are public ones, or have you included private ones in here?
We're looking only at, yeah, it's a great question. We're looking only at government schools here. So one of the things that we're working on right now is looking at the extent to which communities provide their own private schools to make up for the lack of public facilities.
Yeah.
So we're working on that right now. And the answer is, yeah, that seems to be happening somewhat.
Yeah, because at least in like the qualitative evidence that you showed initially, like in Gare and Jaffrelot, it seems like there's a lot of NGO and community activities happening in Muslim quote unquote ghettos, at the ghettos that emerged after sort of the post the riot. That's different.
Yeah, and that does seem to be the case. It does seem to be the case that in a lot of Muslim areas, there is higher levels of private provision of schools, precisely in those areas where there are lower levels of public facilities. We're working on that right now. It looks like they don't make up entirely for the gap, but but that's something that we're actively working on right now, and obviously really important. But it should be pointed out that even if they're fully making up for the gaps, that's coming at a cost because these communities have to provide it themselves, right? And so that's coming out of something. That's coming out of consumption, or that's coming out of other investments in human capital, or right? Okay. So there's really, let me just get right to urban segregation. So first, here are those same figures of the distribution of segregation across urban cities. On the left, now smaller, are the rural sub-district segregation numbers that I showed you earlier. And what you can see here is that urban segregation follows a very similar pattern. SCs are more segregated than Muslims. Both are pretty damn segregated. And actually, when you look in the bottom right on urban dissimilarity, using a unit of aggregation of basically neighborhoods of about 4,000 population, that allows us to compare to US blocks, because in the US, a census block has a population of approximately 4,000. And so we want to make sure we're comparing apples to apples by using the same unit of aggregation. And what you can basically see here is that scheduled castes and US blacks are about as segregated. There are a bunch of places in the US, that's the green line is US blacks. There are a bunch of cities in the US where US blacks are like way more segregated than even scheduled castes and Muslims in India. But on average, US blacks look quite a bit like the average for scheduled castes, and that's higher than for Muslims. What you can see here is that when we look at secondary schools, and so on the y-axis is the probability that a neighborhood has a secondary school, about 2% of neighborhoods in cities have secondary schools. What you can see here is that that's decreasing for scheduled castes, but it's really very strongly decreasing for Muslims. The more Muslim a neighborhood is, the higher the share of the neighborhood that's Muslim, the less likely it is by far to have a secondary school. And so roughly speaking, when you go from a neighborhood with no Muslims to a neighborhood with all Muslims, you're basically cutting in half the probability that that neighborhood ends up with a secondary school, a government secondary school. And so you can do this in regression form. And what we see here, look on the right is urban. I already showed you the results on the left, which are rural. So interestingly, actually SC neighborhoods in urban areas are slightly more likely to have government primary schools, perhaps because of government programs trying to target SCs. I don't know. This is challenging to attribute causality to, because we're just looking in this one cross section. It's the only, basically, you can only look in this one time period. But we see for both SCs and Muslims, their neighborhoods are much less likely to have secondary schools, much less likely to have health. It's quite large effects, because you have to take into account how unlikely neighborhoods are overall to have these facilities. So as a proportion of the overall likelihood to have a secondary school or a health facility, these are very large effects. You can also see that basically everyone is poorer in neighborhoods that have more, in this case, SCs. Look on the right. So as the share of the neighborhood that is SC goes up, everyone is worse off. The same thing is true as the share of the population that's Muslim goes up. Everyone's worse off. But other groups are always richer than, generally speaking, than SCs. And Muslims in our data are actually coming in the poorest in these urban neighborhoods after taking out like the city fixed effect. Okay. When we look, let me just wrap up real quick. When we look over time, what we're seeing is that actually SC, now we're looking back at villages, because we can look at the same villages in 1991 and 01 and 2011. And what we can see here is that even though most villages have primary schools at this point, the Muslim disadvantage in primary schools hasn't disappeared over time. The SC disadvantage in primary schools has disappeared. But when you look at secondary schools, when you look at health facilities in particular, so when you look at secondary schools, a lot of secondary schools have been built between 1991 and 2011, and they're disproportionately going to non-Muslim areas. They're actually slightly disproportionately going to SC areas. So the coefficient on SC is getting closer to 0, whereas the coefficient on Muslim is getting more and more negative. But when you look at health facilities, and a lot of health facilities have been built in this time period, those are disproportionately going to the areas that are neither SC nor Muslim. These coefficients are getting more and more negative over time. We can't do this in urban areas because we only see these urban neighborhoods in this one time period in 2012-13. But at least when it comes to villages, we can track them over time. So basically, we have these maps of segregation. Interestingly, I think the takeaway from the maps is that segregation is sort of all over the place. That like, it's not like the North is so much more segregated than the South. Segregation looks pretty high in a lot of parts of Karnataka, looks pretty high in various parts of UP, but there's a lot of variation even within states. Younger cities, as I said, are a bit less segregated. The more recent a city became a town in the population census, the less segregated it is, but these lines are not super steep. It's not like the newest cities are very unsegregated. They're still actually very segregated. And I'm just gonna skip through. We have a ton of other results. As I said before, when you know rural segregation in an area, it is very strongly predictive of nearby urban segregation. So more segregated rural areas are reproducing that segregation in nearby cities, which I interpret as evidence that there's a very, very strong cultural component to this. But much more work is needed here. US Black segregation, as we already saw before, falls sort of in between the two, but is kind of closer to SC segregation. But the scale that you measure segregation at really matters. Segregation is extraordinarily high when you're using a small neighborhood size. As you aggregate up neighborhoods, segregation comes down and down. Okay, there's a lot that we want to do going forward. We do want to ask this question that Archie brought up of like private provision compensating for inequalities in public amenities. We're working on that right now, and preliminary results suggest that particularly Muslim neighborhoods are making up for some of the lack of public facilities. We also find effects that vary by income quartile, where the poorest areas are facing the largest total discrepancies. I think a lot more work is needed in this space, so let me just talk about what I think we want to do and what I hope other people do. But basically what we're finding here is we argue that segregation is really greatly understudied in low-income countries, that we're very limited by the data that we have access to. And we've known that rural areas in India have been segregated for centuries. not longer. Are these inequalities being replicated in India's booming cities? The answer seems to be yes. In some ways, outcomes are even more unequal in India's cities. While SCs are more segregated, Muslims seem to be sort of suffering more from this segregation. Highly Muslim neighborhoods are more disadvantaged when it comes to the provision of government facilities than even highly SC neighborhoods are. And we hope that we or others in future papers can make a bunch of progress understanding the causes of this segregation. This is something, again, we have only a single cross-section, so we can't really say a ton about the causes of segregation. One is the rise of Hindu nationalist politics. Another is the closely related issue of violence. A third is discrimination in housing markets, where people may not want to be as segregated as they are, but they can't get houses in other neighborhoods. And certainly there's a lot of work that's been done, more qualitative work on this. And we're starting a bit of work on social norms using data from the Anthropological Survey of India and trying to understand the extent to which social norms against mixing with other groups, which really do vary across different communities, help to explain some of the patterns of segregation that we find. And zooming all the way back out, I've already said this, but I'll repeat it again. Better data is really needed to advance the study of inequality in India. In particular, we think that a lot of the drivers of inequality are hyper-local, are really about your neighborhood, your village, your part of town, and not necessarily your whole city or your whole district. Unfortunately, a lot of the richest data sets, like the NSS or the IHTS, are really basically district level data sets. And the resolution of data really doesn't often fit the resolution of the problem. In these couple of papers, we're establishing new facts about mobility and segregation, but we really can't say very much about the causal drivers of these patterns. We tried to a bit get into the gap between Muslims and SCs when it comes to mobility, but there's just so much more to be said about the drivers of these inequalities than we've been able to in these papers. I think that there are many areas that need a lot more research, and a bunch of them have come up today. Discrimination in labor markets, housing markets, social norms, the role of urbanization in creating greater equality of opportunity or not. It looks like maybe urban areas are repeating some of the inequalities of rural areas, and so on. And I really look forward to talking with you all in the time that we have, and seeing all of the great work that many of you do in the future. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam. I think we have a lot of questions, which I don't think we'll be able to take them all in the 15 minutes that we have. But I guess we could get started with some questions that arose in the chat while you were speaking.
Sure.
So the first one was by Tausif, and he was asking about differences in sort of educational norms across communities, and how sort of, say, something like madrasa education for Muslims is measured in those graphs on intergenerational mobility for Muslims.
Great. So I think this issue of different social norms is a really important one. It's generally been very difficult to study and often abused around the world to suggest that like different communities value education very differently, and that's why some people get less education. I think if we've learned anything about the drivers of education, a lot of it has to do with the returns to education, with the resources available to communities, with the facilities available to different groups, and so on. And a lot less, basically everyone wants education, though that might vary a little bit in terms of social norms. When it comes to madrasas, this question comes up a lot. It's a good question, but I can very confidently rule that out for driving our mobility results. So one sort of little known fact is that madrasas get a lot more attention from sort of social scientists than they do from Muslim students. So 2% of Muslim students in the IHTS are actually in madrasas. And so it really just can't be explaining our results at all, because it's such a negligible proportion of the overall Muslim population.
One question I had was that, so you pointed out in the causal effects of affirmative action that they were local average treatment effects. So we can't really compare the effect of treatment as keeping Muslims as a comparison group over there. But I was wondering if you were thinking of something like the role of minority institutions in actually advancing education, and if there's a way to measure that maybe that could make for a stronger case for affirmative action for Muslims. I'm not sure.
Yeah, so interestingly, a lot of, after this research first came out, like there were a bunch of sort of op-eds in different places that were saying like, is now maybe a time to revisit Muslim affirmative action and reservations. I don't think that we can say a whole lot more about that. I'm glad that people are talking about these issues and more broadly thinking about how to close these gaps. Affirmative action certainly seems to be a very powerful tool, though I think there may be a lot of other ones. We haven't studied sort of minority institutions, given the high resolution data that we've generated in others. Like you can certainly imagine people running, conducting studies where they look at, for example, distance to minority universities and so on, and seeing whether that's sort of strongly predictive of educational gaps and whether that helps to drive higher levels of Muslim educational attainment. I think that would be a really cool study. I would love to see it. You could do it at a really fine level because, you know, the Shrug gives you all 600,000 villages and 8,000 towns. So if someone picks it up and runs with it, please do send that my way, and I'm happy to advise on that or help in any way that I can.
There's one question from Asad, who's asking the caste and religion of local leaders, such as the Sarpanch of the village, might be a cause, and if a village with a Muslim or an SC Sarpanch might lead to better public good provisions for the community. Is that something that you're seeing as well?
Yeah, again, that's another great question that I would love someone to take and run with. And it should be relatively easy to match this up to reservations. You could imagine reservations at the MLA level, reservations at the panchayat level. You know, we don't have that for Muslims so much. You might be able to take advantage of close elections. My suspicion is that, you know, the patterns that we're observing are the accumulation of decades and centuries of differential treatment and opportunities. And I suspect that huge differences are not going to emerge in the short run based on the identity of a Sarpanch or whatever. But I think that's an open question. I think it's a really good question. I know that Radhika Jain and Pascaline Dupas have this new paper on gender disparities in health, and they find that reservations for female Sarpanches in Rajasthan end up having significant effects on gender gaps in healthcare utilization. So those are relatively short run effects. So things can move. And that sort of healthcare utilization isn't even under the direct control of the Sarpanch in any way. And so very plausible that you could find those effects here. I would love to see a study on that.
I think Tejaswini has a question. Tejaswini,
yes.
Yeah.
So I have actually one clarification and one question. So in the slide before this, I mean the second last slide, you laid down the 4 potential causes for segregation. So are they specifically for the Muslim community or also for SCs?
Yeah, so these are for anyone. I mean, I think that, you know, Hindu nationalist politics are probably going to affect Muslims more than SCs, but politics in India are complicated and you never know. And maybe there are other sort of political trends that might be affecting SCs that are worthy of study. You know, basically what I said is we have this cross section, and so we can say what the facts are. We can say in 2011-12, what does segregation look like? How different are Muslim to non-Muslim neighborhoods or SC to non-SC neighborhoods? And that's not a binary, right? What we showed is that they're continuous, and they're neighborhoods with 25% SCs, 50% SCs, 75% SCs. There are many, many potential causes, and the study of these issues are just much further along in other countries like the United States, where people have really been studying segregation intensively since the 1960s, and we have the sort of high resolution data that allow us to study it going back decades. And when you have data over time in segregation, you can look at drivers of it, because you can say, okay, look, these areas had the same segregation in the 1960s, but then, you know, riots broke out in these areas and not in these areas, and then what happened to segregation over time, right? Or police reforms, or you name it. Like there are all these different things that might be driving it. And so the literature in the US, the quantitative literature on segregation is quite advanced, though I think there's a lot that we don't know both about the causes and the effects. In India, I think one of the major challenges is going to be, how the heck do we look back in time? How do we look at where people were living in the 1980s, in the 1990s, or even going further back, ideally, in order to be able to study this over time? My hope is that when the 2021 census comes out, assuming the 2021 census will come out in India, that we'll be able to get access to EB level data. So far, the census has never released EB level data on religion. They have for SCs, and so there's a group of scholars who are doing really interesting work using EB level census data to look at SC segregation. But even then, you only know the demographics of these areas. You don't know like their assets, you don't know placement of public goods and so on. You need to get that from other data sets. So I'm actually giving a talk in a couple weeks at the India Policy Forum, and that's going to all be about open data for development. I encourage many of you to attend. But basically, we're going to be arguing that so many issues require such richer data to really study, and that what the Indian government does is it collects a ton of really, really rich data and then just sits on it. Right? The census has incredibly rich data on every single household and neighborhood in the country. They don't release that. They release basic aggregates at the village level, basic aggregates at the town level. But towns have enormous inequality. Different people live in different neighborhoods, getting different access to public goods, to jobs, to clean water, to clean air even. And we need to really get data at the resolution that these problems exist at. So I wasn't trying to be exhaustive at all in these four. I think there are unfortunately many, many different drivers of segregation in India and around the world. And these are four that I think we might be able to make some progress on, given data that either exist or could possibly exist. But I would love to hear about other ideas for what might be first order factors driving segregation. And then I think there's this whole other question about what are the consequences of segregation, and in particular, it might be easier to address some of the mediating factors that are leading to really negative consequences of segregation than it might be to address the segregation itself. I mean, as a world, we need to be moving on all of these fronts. There's no reason not to work on all of these things. But given that segregation seems likely to be extremely persistent, I think one of the really big questions is, how do we make it less harmful? How do we make sure that it's not limiting the educational opportunities of kids born in segregated neighborhoods, even if kids for a very long time are going to be growing up in segregated neighborhoods, realistically?
I just sort of also wanted to point out that there seems to be also coming out some work, and there is some evidence that it might be the case that in India, segregation is not necessarily bad for education outcomes, at least, or even height for AZ scores for Dalit children living in Dalit neighborhoods.
Yep.
That's sort of like, I mean, I'm it's obviously a very problematic thing to say, but at the same time, at least it seems that in the case of India, that's what the data has been telling different researchers.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was wondering, like, what are your thoughts on that? How do we deal with that? Because in the US, I feel like that's just something that's not acceptable, because segregation is just considered to be this bad thing. But it might be that people are choosing to live in different neighborhoods because of discrimination and violence, and they feel more, they feel safer in more segregated enclaves.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's real. In my own family, my father went to a high school that was 98% Jewish, and he experienced much more anti-Semitism in college than he did in high school, because it was in high school, he grew up in an ethnic enclave, and almost everybody belonged to the same community. I hope that that other 2% didn't experience any discrimination in his ethnic enclave. But we actually found kind of similar outcomes when we started looking into educational segregation. We were finding some evidence that SC students seem to be performing better in more SC areas. And that's certainly consistent with a bunch of qualitative evidence on sort of discrimination against SC students by other groups. I don't have any good solutions here. I think we really want to understand the role of the teachers play. I think we want to understand the role that and basically we want to understand, how do you change these norms? I think the big questions are, how do you change these norms so that kids can grow up together and benefit from growing up together, and not face discrimination from growing up together. And it's just really, really hard. I think that the research on social norms is really at its infancy, and the tools we have at our disposal for trying to kind of re-engineer norms. I think that's a major part of development, is this slow process of learning to live together, and treat everybody with dignity. But I think we're very bad at knowing what to do about it. We're trying to put together this data set on social norms, which include norms on mixing with other communities, based on the anthropological surveys of India that were conducted by the British around 1900, and then by the Indian government around 1990. I hope this is a really valuable resource for studying the evolution of social norms over the long run. And we want to look at how urbanization and other sort of economic changes affect norms towards women, norms towards other communities, and so on. How basically these social norms evolve within communities and then propagate across communities over time. But I think certainly economists are very, very unsophisticated when it comes to thinking about social norms and just generating evidence on it.
I have another question, Arishidi, if you let me.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, this is not a very technical question, and might be also because of my inability to follow the paper thoroughly. But while going through the segregation part, one thing that keep on coming into my mind is that this is something that I really know as a fact, that segregation, or maybe I would say ghettos in India, are something that are facts to a lot of us, and that these segregated communities do not get access to most of the public facilities is also something that we know and we have seen. And so one of the reasons why the government providers will not provide public good to that community is precisely because that segregated part belongs to a certain community. So I was thinking that how do you think that such kind of research, such kind of using data would help us in better policy making in this sense? I mean, how do you uh, make things better off in these segregated communities using such data?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think that I get these kind of questions all the time, which is sort of, we knew this already, Sam. We knew that India was really segregated. We knew that areas that have a lot of marginalized communities are treated worse by the government. Like, no shit, basically. How does this actually change anything? And I think that's a great question. My hope is that, first of all, so two things. One, I think what's obvious to many is not obvious to all. And you certainly see in the US, Blacks and whites, for example, have very, very different perspectives on the amount of discrimination that there is in the country. And so I think that documenting discrimination really, really carefully can help to bring along that, I think, pretty sizable group of relatively well-intentioned people who just may not know what it's like to live in these neighborhoods or to belong to these communities. So I'd like to think that there are a lot of people out there who actually would respond to evidence. I think it forces the conversation. I think demonstrating these things say you can't run away from this. You have to come up with some other explanation. I think that there are probably, if you conducted a survey of people across India saying, are more Muslim neighborhoods, do they have fewer schools? I bet a lot of people would say no. They're probably like, no, the government puts schools everywhere. The government puts health facilities everywhere. I don't know how people would respond, but I suspect that a lot of people would say no. Now, how many of them would take this research seriously? I don't know, but I'm hoping that I'm contributing to a larger conversation. And that's part of why it's very important to me that I not just kind of publish in journals, but that we kind of engage with much wider communities, because I hope that this is feeding into a broader conversation in India, and not just kind of ending up on syllabi or in peer-reviewed journals, as great and fun as that is. So I think the broader question here is a theory of change around research, and how does evidence translate into change? You know, I think it takes many forms. I'm going to be talking a bit about how open data can contribute to development in India through various channels, through private sector channels, through civil society organizations, through administration and bureaucracy, through policy making at higher levels. I don't mean to be Pollyannish. I don't think that like just, you know, releasing data or releasing results just kind of magically changes these things. These are massive, sticky problems that are unfortunately likely to be around in 100 and 200 years from now. But my hope is that this research kind of empowers a set of researchers to go and do much deeper research into what the causes are and what the consequences are, what can be done about it, that convinces some well-meaning people that this is more of a problem than they perhaps appreciated. And I don't even know all the different ways that these might be used. Like one of the things we're arguing in this IPF paper is that the private sector can often make really good use of data and research for, you know, private sector pursuits, but that can benefit people more widely. Like if, you know, there's really good data on where the government is not providing schools, maybe like chains of high quality private schools can like find it easier to open up and target themselves into neighborhoods where the educational facilities aren't currently adequate, but there might be a lot of demand. That's just one probably silly example. But my hope is that this can empower oversight organizations, government officials, and so on to correct this. I mean, I don't think you can correct this mistargeting until you know that it's happening. And I suspect that at least a lot of people don't even know that it's happening because it's an emergent property, right? It's an emergent property of a million little decisions by people about where to live and about, you know, bureaucrats and policymakers and so on about where to place schools. It's not that like one super powerful person is just deciding to really discriminate on the placement of schools. It's that this is emerging over time, and if it's emerging over time, it can also be fixed over time.
Thank you.
Sam,
Hey, Sam. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, sorry. I think we're a little over time. I don't know, Sam, are you okay to take one last question and then?
Yeah, let's take one last question and then I
Alright,
should get going.
Thank you. Sorry, Dhruv, please go ahead.
So I have one question. So even in Muslims, there are categories SC, OBC, ST. So in the data, was there any mention of from which category the Muslims are, or it's like all Muslims, which includes even the upper caste Muslims and the lower caste Muslims?
Yeah, so ours is entirely just anyone who has a Muslim name is being categorized as Muslim. As I said earlier in the talk, I think that it would be really interesting to go into greater detail about the different Muslim communities. We know that there are gradations. We know that even though Islam doesn't technically have caste, that caste is very much still a practice among many Muslims in South Asia. There are broad categories of elite Muslims and non-elite. There are more finer categories of jatis and other endogamous communities within Muslims. I think this is a great issue for further research. We're not in a great position to tell the difference between them, but I hope that someone else can do good research on this.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Sam, also for staying with us, even though we went over time. But we really hope we can continue the conversation, and there's a lot of interest among members in the organization to hopefully associate themselves with the fantastic work that Development Data Lab is doing and use the data sources on Shrug. And hope we can continuously engage with putting out the very important research you're doing in the public domain by way of translations or other initiatives. And thank you for everyone for being here today and staying patient with us. And we hope to see you in future sessions as well. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much, everyone. Really appreciate this opportunity, and do stay in